May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. In our first lesson this morning, we have Moses leading his flock beyond the wilderness. Over these past months, it feels a bit like we have been continuing beyond the wilderness, beyond any paths that we have ever trod, with very real concerns around health and safety as we continue to live with the coronavirus, and the many decisions to be made around beginning the new school year, with the unrest in our nation around the very real issues of racial injustice, the national political conventions, and how we move forward as a people and a nation, how we move forward in dialogue, as neighbors and as family in the midst of such unrest. Our story of Moses this week picks up after he has fled to Midian from Egypt, where he had killed an Egyptian guard who was beating an Israelite. He marries, has a son, and works as a shepherd for his father-in-law. He has settled into a new life, yet he names his son Gershom, for he says, I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. Moses is not completely at home here. During this time, back in Egypt, the Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. God took notice of them. The story of Moses' encounter with a God whose name cannot be nailed down is not just about one man's encounter with the divine. This was initiated in God's people calling out to God to be released from their bondage, and God tapping Moses as just the person to pull this off. God's calling and commissioning of Moses has all the classic elements of the calling of the prophets, all the way to Mary. There is spectacle, here, the burning bush, an attention-grabbing address, Moses, Moses, an appropriate show of humility, Moses removing his sandals, God's promise, I will deliver my people from bondage, and I will be with you. The self-deprecating hesitation, I can't do this. And God's reassurance, oh yes, you can. This dialogue between God and Moses starts out with lots of I statements from God. Statements that Moses was probably very supportive of. I have observed the misery of my people. I have heard their cry. I know their sufferings. I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, flowing with milk and honey. But then comes the pivotal I statement. I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt. At this, Moses' ears prick right up, and so does his guard. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? The prophet's objection always highlights the prophet's dependence upon God in undertaking any holy work, and demonstrates an appropriate sense of humility. But even with all of God's assurances, Moses will raise 4 objections over these chapters before he just simply blurts out, "Oh, my Lord, please send someone else." And who has not felt this way at one time or another? When Moses asks, "Whom shall he tell the Israelites is sending him?" God responds, "I am who I am." Or as it can also be translated, "I will be what I will be." This mysterious name that God gives to Moses may lead to many philosophical and mystical interpretations, but in its grammatical essence, it means, "I am only known to myself," or more bluntly, "Do not try to box me in." In fairness to Moses, I think we have heard this story so many times, and we know what happens next, that we forget that Moses really has not had much to do with this God up until now. And this is a burning bush, after all, that is not being consumed, beyond the wilderness, on a mountain. And he is just tending a flock of sheep. And this voice asks him to go back to Egypt to rescue a few 100,000 slaves and to lead them back through the desert toward freedom in a new land. Not a small task. Moses had gotten off the path, and when God saw that he had turned aside, God called to him. God did not speak until Moses had turned aside. If he hadn't turned, would God have spoken? Could his turning aside have actually brought forth God's speech? Are we able to use this time of our being beyond the wilderness, being off our familiar paths, as a time to pay attention, off our usual path of how we have always done things, aware of just how unsettling this all is? Are we able to use this time of our being beyond the wilderness to take off our shoes, believing that this place where we stand is holy ground? It has been suggested that perhaps part of the reason we are experiencing this deep unrest around issues of racial and socioeconomic injustice is because we have been forced out of our familiar daily patterns of our usual busyness, our usual patterns of getting from point A to point B on autopilot to accomplish the known XYZ, and rushing past what may be happening around us, keeping our heads down as we plow forward, maybe catching the news of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and then moving on. But perhaps over these months, we have been unsettled out of our usual routines enough to turn aside, to see and hear God's call to us. And I know that for many, you have been seeing and hearing and experiencing and responding to this cry as well as this call for a lifetime. And now more of us are paying greater attention. For God has heard the cries of his people and calls each and every one of us. What might we be called to do? This week at Compline, Tamba shared with us the need not only to create safe space for all people, but also brave space, space in which all voices are respected, allowing each other to speak and to be in honest conversation. We all feel a bit inadequate in some of the roles that we are asked to assume, whether it be a parent or a caregiver or an advocate for the voiceless, especially during these times. Who am I that I should do this? Moses is an alien in a strange land, but he has always been so from the time he was adopted and raised in Pharaoh's court. We all have those moments in our lives when we find ourselves in foreign territory. And right now, we are all finding ourselves in foreign territory, feeling a bit out of our element, to say the least. And in such times, we do see things that we might have missed before. We do gain a different perspective. And yet our question often remains, who am I that I should do this? And God's response is always the same. I will be with you. God calls each of us to works large and small continually. Most of us do not see ourselves as the stuff of which faith heroes are made. But as we have seen in our lessons this summer, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, and Rebecca were all quite flawed characters, and yet God used these flaws to do extraordinary things. And so God works through and with us to bring about God's kingdom on earth. If not now, when? God has heard the cries of God and taken notice. And God says, I will send you and I will be with you. Amen.